Rodmersham Church is a peaceful place today, but in May 1835 it was the scene of bitter and bloody rioting.
There had been protests and riots a few years earlier, mainly by poor and agricultural labourers. These were the swing riots, which had started in Kent.
The destruction of labour-saving machinery, arson, threatening letters and protest meetings demanding improved wages became daily occurrences as the powerless farm labourers desperately tried to improve their conditions. The old poor law had failed. Changes were clearly needed, and Poor Law Amendment Law was rushed through Parliament, and it became law in August 1834. The amount of relief paid was to be cut drastically, and up to half of it was to be paid in vouchers for bread. This was to stop the men spending all their money in the pubs and alehouses. You can imagine this wasn't popular. As this system was introduced, there were angry protests.
There was trouble at Bapchild on the 30th of April, with 2 men arrested, and word was spreading.
The local magistrate, the Reverend Poor, no pun intended, had to take special constables with him to Bredgar on the 2nd of May. There was trouble at Doddington Workhouse on the 4th of May.
The officials tasked with handing out the bread tickets were jostled and intimidated.
Many of the same faces were showing up at some of these events. The trouble here at Rodmersham occurred on May the 7th, Thursday, May the 7th. Officials were making the weekly payments in the parish church here. And for the first time, bread vouchers were being handed out. The chairman of the Milton Union Board of Guardians had arrived on his horse at around noon, and there were already about 30 protesters here. The protesters, mainly from surrounding parishes, had already gathered outside the church. A handful of them had already been at previous protests in neighbouring parishes, but for some of them, well, perhaps the majority, this was their first time.
As the poor, the claimants, who were mainly women, left the church, the protesters, led by a Major, that was his first name, Merton, so Major Merton, tried to turn them back into the church and demand that the ticket be replaced with money.
In one account, Merton shouts at one of the women coming out of the church, "You've got a ticket." "No, I haven't," she says. "You liar." And in tears the woman returns to the church. Tempers were running high and tension had been mounting all week. Some of the protesters had clubs and the atmosphere was very tense.
It was reported later in court that 2 of the protesters had blackened their faces, and one of the leaders, William Robinson, wore a red cap. Another held a placard reading "No bread tickets."
Sitting astride his horse at the church gate, Sir John Tilden observed the growing crowd and the protesters.
Sir John was chair of the Milton Union Board of Guardians. His family had been the local squires for centuries, and he warned the crowd that jail sentences were likely unless they dispersed. But no one took any notice.
The mob grew increasingly restless, egged on by Merton, William Robinson, Jonah Milgate and James Taylor. After almost 2 hours of barracking, one of the officials in the church, Henry Matson, decided that enough was enough and something had to be done. He escorted one lady from the church, but he was pushed to the ground and punched. Seeing his son knocked down and punched by the mob, his father, John, rushed to his aid, only to be felled by a single punch from Major Merton. Sir John Tilden came to his rescue, his horse forcing the crowd to back off. John Matson scrambled into the safety of the church. With the situation now getting out of hand, Sir John Tilden rode off to get assistance. His presence here wasn't really helping.
He was looking for the chairman of the local magistrates' bench, the Reverend Dr. John Poor. The Reverend Poor was the Vicar of Merston, and actually a fierce critic of the new Act. But he was one of the most active magistrates in the area, with a reputation for mediation and reconciliation.
But he couldn't be found. He was 8 miles away in Faversham. Tilden returned to Rodmersham, unsure of what to do next. Still at Rodmersham Church was Thomas Slater, a member of the Milton Board of Guardians, who offered to go to Faversham to look for the Reverend Poor and ask him to bring a detachment of soldiers who were standing by. Unable to do anything for the time being, Sir John Tilden went home to await reinforcements, he said. The first of these reinforcements to arrive were 2 Metropolitan Police officers, Inspector Carter and Sergeant Stockley.
They arrived in a horse-drawn chaise, coming up a narrow track northeast of the church.
On arrival, they arrested the first threatening protester they could find, which was James Blanche. This enraged the mob even more, and Major Merton and William Robinson rushed at the police officers.
Merton struck their horse with a stick, and the mob tried to overturn the chaise, but the lane was too narrow. Meanwhile, the officials, still trapped in the church, took advantage of this diversion and made a hurried exit through the back door. But they were spotted and chased, with mud and stones flying in their direction.
In all the confusion and noise, Sir John Tilden had now returned with some special constables. Now 3 magistrates had arrived, including the Reverend Poor, to try to quell the riot. But as they arrived, the officials were trying to flee the back door of the church, and they got caught up in the melee and the confusion, and they just turned and ran with the officials.
Around a bend in the road, hidden from view, was a detachment of soldiers of the 28th Regiment of Foot.
The protesters realised they were running into a trap.
"Run, boys, it's the military!" somebody shouted.
The protesters turned and ran, pursued by special constables and soldiers, and for the most part they managed to outrun their pursuers. Over hedges, down paths, across fields, they dissolved into the countryside.
20 arrests were made, and the offenders taken to Sittingbourne and charged.
None of the arrested were natives of Rodmersham.
They came from parishes nearby, like Linstead, Newnham, Lenham, Doddington, Witchling, Hollingbourne, Bredgar, Sittingbourne and Milton.
People seemed bolder when they were away from home. The accused were put into carts and taken to St Augustine's jail in Canterbury to await trial. News of the arrests had spread, and a mob assembled to throw stones, but when they saw the escort of yeoman cavalry with swords drawn, they soon dispersed.
The trial took place on the 3rd and 4th of June. Each of the accused were convicted and received sentences of hard labour. Some just 1 day, but the others between 3 months and 2 years. Merton and Robinson each received 2 years. Well, bread tickets continued to be issued, but Sittingbourne's protests were all but over. Peace returned to Rodmersham. The demonstrations seemed to have been in vain, but the populace's views had been made known. The disturbances may have had a limiting effect on the severity with which the changes were introduced. Fear of further trouble may well have persuaded some of the boards of guardians to continue with payment of relief on a wider and longer scale than had originally been intended.
The disturbances in the Sittingbourne area against the new Poor Law Act were the first, but they were not to be the last.
There was little serious opposition south of the Thames, but further north, where a new industrial class was being created, there was a great deal of trouble. Indeed, in some parts of the Pennines, the new Poor Law was never really enforced. So why did the men of Kent fail, if their protest can be seen as ending in failure? It was certainly not for a lack of strong leaders. But the demonstrators showed no desire to press home their point when faced with authority. Respect for the older order might have been slipping, but it had not disappeared altogether. When arrested, only one demonstrator attempted to put forward any defence of his action. The demonstrators were not revolutionaries, but simple poor country folk who had no vote, no trade unions, no influence, and no acceptable way of showing their dissatisfaction. This had been their only recourse to seek justice. If you're interested in the history of Rodmersham Village, this book, Rodmersham 2000, The Story of a Village, was published by the Parish Council and may still be available. There is also our own book, a look at Rodmersham 1850 to 1955, and that's available from our website. If you have found this video interesting, please subscribe to our YouTube channel or visit our website.